When the shadow lenders went away, so then nobody wanted to buy these collateralized debt obligations. They put them up for sale, and they weren't worth anything because there was no market for them. And then there was a panic around the world because if theirs weren't worth anything, then all these collateralized debt obligations owned by all these funds and sitting on the books of the banks, they weren't worth anything either. So that was when the whole credit market collapsed. And then you couldn't get investors to buy that stuff off the bank's books. So now they say they're fully loaned up, and they're right. They are fully loaned up. I mean, they've made as many loans as they can make that are good, sound loans. They can't be doing subprime anymore because nobody's going to buy this stuff off their books. And so they have to make reasonable loans, and they've already got their 9 loans for every $1 in deposits. So that, since all money is debt, all those extra mortgages have gone away. There's nobody's creating those loans anymore, and some of the old loans are getting paid back, of course, but there aren't new loans to replace them. So the money supply shrank. I read one place $10 trillion. There's a $10 trillion hole in the money supply. So even though the Fed has pumped a couple trillion out there, they've not come anywhere near to replacing what was lost. So we're still actually in a deflationary spiral, and you can tell that because nobody can get credit.
I was just going to say that's what I've been hearing, that nobody can get credit. And also, what do you think about a huge consolidation of banks and banks getting bailed out but not wanting to issue the credit? I mean, it's strange.
Yeah. Well, the problem is they're actually behaving rationally because a bank is a private corporation. It's required by law to serve the interests of its shareholders. And so if it did things that were not if they didn't, they have to look at their quarterly profits. That's what they have to do. And so if they don't do the thing that's going to make the most money for the shareholders, they could be out of job. So they can't be making loans that are likely to default, and they can't go beyond their reserve and capital requirements because those rules are imposed on them. So they're stuck. So that's why it seems to me the solution is to set up a whole different banking system with a totally clean set of books and with deep, deep, deep assets and capital. I mean, so much capital that there's no way we're going to run out of capital in the state. If we make it a DBA of the state, which is what in North Dakota, the Bank of North Dakota is listed as North Dakota doing business as the Bank of North Dakota. That means the state is the bank. So everything the state owns, the bank owns.
I'm sure that there are people out there who could be extremely excited about this, but it is a paradigm shift of thinking because many people think that if the state gets in charge of something, that it'll just be another fat cat misusing and abusing its power. There's a lot of people afraid about the power of states. So that's the other side of it. But it's a paradigm shift of thinking once you know the mechanism that can create the money on a parallel level. Probably it'll function as well as the stewardship that's going to be making it happen, like everything else. Mm-hmm. But I was speaking with Dr. Kavari the other day in an interview, who's running for governor, who was on our first show together. And I said to him, we can reconstruct the whole banking system and we can go ahead and issue a state bank. He fell in love with your idea about your revelation about the Bank of North Dakota and has it on his game plan to do that in Florida. But I asked him the question, what he thought about the whole credit system and the way the credit system is designed, not so much the banks issuing credit, but for individuals getting credit. And I said to him, if that model and that paradigm is not changed in association with setting up what's new, then you really don't have a new thing. You have a more of the same. Because you can create a criteria which most people will be enslaved by rather than being able to create by. When you're setting up a new banking system and monetizing a new economy through state-chartered banks, there's a whole other side of it. There's another end of it which has to do with the consumer end. The consumer that's going to get credit. Muhammad Yunus set up the Grameen Bank, and he changed the rules and the game and the paradigm and the structure. they don't have a credit system the way we do here in America, where you have X number of points and you have to check your credit. And if something happens, it's on your credit report for 7 years and that whole thing. So he created something different and showed that most people would be reliable. You know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a whole other piece of like a whole systems approach to the whole thing while the state chartered banks are going on.
Mm-hmm. They actually charge 16% interest at the Grameen Bank. So it's, I mean, I was reading it on their website that it's a much better deal than what those poor women used to have, which was 200 or 300% interest.
But it's still too much money. I agree.
Yeah, but that's why the state bank is a step up from that, because as Dr. Kavari laid out in his numbers, you could charge 2% interest, and you're still going to make 18% interest because you are taking your capital base and fanning it into 9 times that sum in loans. So you're lending that 2% money out 9 times. So you're getting 18%.
I love that. I love that. And he also had, interesting in his book, a whole other take on the GDP that's interesting that I had him talk about on the last show. But how far do you think we are from being able to have a trial with a state-owned bank?
Well, actually, things are getting close in Michigan. There are actually discussions with important people there. There are people working on this that they kind of want to keep a low profile, you know, because you don't want to call out the big guns before you've got your ducks in the row.
I hear you. Sounds
good.
But
there are definitely things happening, and I think it'll definitely happen, because what other alternative is there? I mean, states are strapped, and for instance, in New Mexico, they exploited that state with, I guess it was mining, but anyway, it's like been stripped to make money, and the money went, I think it was to Lehman Brothers. Anyway, the money was lost. So they are like hopping mad. They do not want to be sending more money out to Wall Street. So if they can set up an alternative system that works, they'll be ecstatic. It seems to me that once you set up such a bank, people are so annoyed at the regular banks, or particularly the Wall Street banks, you know, the out-of-state banks, the big out-of-state banks, that they will flee to this state bank. They'll support it as a matter of patriotic duty.
It sounds very, very exciting. Very, very exciting. One more thing I want to ask you about the state of Guernsey, the island state of Guernsey, located in the Channel Islands between England and France. In this article, you talked about it. It has funded infrastructure with government-issued money for over 200 years without price inflation and government debt. Amazing. Mm-hmm. And why was Guernsey able to do that? Because it was issuing its own currency?
Yes, and that's the thing. And they just declared that the government would never go into debt. They would just issue currency for what they needed. They don't have an inflation problem. They built all this they desperately needed infrastructure, and some sane person looked around and said, "Well, this is insane. We have the workers, we have the materials, the roads and the walls are falling apart. We need to rebuild this stuff. Well, the only thing we're lacking is the money. So let's just issue it, call it payment. You know, we the community acknowledge that the work has been done. We're going to issue you little receipts and say, here, you've been paid. This is your money. Go spend it. We, the people of the community, will honor those little sheets of paper and acknowledge that they're worth, you know, your hourly wage, whatever it was you put into it." And that has worked for hundreds of years. And the reason that they haven't been jumped all over like bigger countries that have tried it, I think, is just that they're little and they were under the radar and nobody worried about them. They thought, oh, well, it's a little island off the coast.
A successful infrastructure program funded with interest-free national credit was also instituted in New Zealand, you write here, after it elected its first Labour government in the 1930s. Very exciting. What happened to New Zealand after that?
It worked very well. They funded all this housing, and so they did housing developments that they had very low rents on them, and it was all funded with national credit. In other words, they just created the money on their books. It was the same deal where they hired the people and they paid them with the national credit, and that served as money. I mean, it was money, you know. It was just checking accounts, and you draw in your checking account and you pay with checks, and it goes out into the community. But